So acknowledgement to country, welcome to Politics in the Pub. And it's an acknowledgement of Gadigal country and their elders past and present, and a bit tribute to the wonderful meeting in the park just now. And Jeff's holding a sign.
Vote yes for the Indigenous recognition under our Constitution.
Okay, which is Julian Assange's birthday is on Monday, and there's going to be a commemoration of that 11 o'clock at the British, tomorrow at the British
Consulate at the gateway.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to sing, here's the birthday, I'm going to sing a short happy birthday, you can sing along, please sing along with me. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday dear Julian, happy birthday to you. Okay, and there's another version. Happy. We will free you of an easy, so sleazy. Despite that, Julian, we will free you. Thank you. Now,
Your wife will can't be here. Oh, sorry.
Every year. Oh, okay. I'm kind of used to having to read something which is not only a text, but has generally been fought over by about a dozen groups, and just read to a bunch of people in dark strokes. Every year since 2007, with a gap for COVID, I have presented on behalf of Abolition 2000 and a bunch of NGOs, including people from Nuclear Disarmament, who are just up the road, on the risk of a nuclear apocalypse. Initially focusing on an accidental nuclear apocalypse, because obviously I thought, in my foolishness, no one in their right mind would initiate a non-accidental one, and increasingly these days looking at the possibility of a non-accidental nuclear apocalypse. Every time that I've presented, at least from 2011 onwards, I've said that the risk, as of the time I presented, is as great as it's ever been. Now, you may be aware of the analogy with the climate campaigner who gets up in front of the UN and she says, this year is the hottest year that ever was. And the next year she gets up in front of the UN and she says, this year is the hottest year that ever was. And the year after that she gets up in front of the UN and she says, this year is the hottest year that ever was. Guess what's happening, folks? It's getting hotter. As I've said, the risk is as great as it has ever been, and I've said that every time since 2011 that I've gotten up there. Initially, I said that the risk was as great as it had been since the Cold War ended. Lately, it has been that it is as great as it has ever been, ever. Think about that. The risk of global thermonuclear war is as great as it has ever been, ever. And then cast your mind back to the 1980s and the monstrous demonstrations we had against it. And again, think about, yes, that the risk now is way higher than it ever was back then. Actually, we have stepped back a teensy bit from the brink. There was a peak around February, March, April 2022, and we've receded a little bit from that since then. Again, we were at DEFCON 2 back then, and we went back down to DEFCON 3, and we're now, I think, officially at DEFCON 5. In my capacity as co-convener of Abolition 2000's Nuclear Risk Reduction Working Group, it is my portfolio to pass delicately every pronouncement on nuclear weapons deployment and nuclear weapons posture that comes from the mouth of either Mr. Putin or, of course, Joe Biden. Leaving, bracketing for the moment, questions like whether it really is Mr. Putin making the pronouncement or not, or one of his many body doubles, and inputting his presumed state of mind, the geopolitical background, and above all his oncology. A bad prognosis may mean that he is more inclined to consider apocalyptic scenarios and apocalyptic answers to his geopolitical problems. Military reverses might, emphasise might, mean the same thing. A bad oncology prognosis combined with consistent or dramatic military reverses and of course developments like last week could, just could, emphasise could, mean that he would consider nuclear escalation. Back last Feb 22, I was consistently plagued with a sense of dread deep in my gut. As March and April wore on, it receded just a teeny bit. And we know now again that we were at DEFCON 2 and then DEFCON 3 during those months. At some point in those months, I can't remember precisely when, the head of the CIA met with the head of the FSB. And according to the SVR blog, which I recommend if you want to know what Putin had for breakfast, which doomsday bunker he's currently holed up in, usually the one in the Altai Mountains, or what's happening with his oncology, according to the said SVR blog, the head of the CIA said to the head of the FSB words to the effect of, "Tell your boss that if he orders a nuclear strike, it's the last order he will ever give." We would not expect that to be in the regular media, and it wasn't. Of course, should that ever happen, should the Russian state ever be decapitated, the perimeter system, whose operating principle I worked with for 7 years, the perimeter system, otherwise known as the doomsday machine, would activate and incinerate the US and NATO, whose remaining subs and ICBMs would then do the same in return. I do also recall a claim in the SVR blog from around April, followed by a CIA report quite independently to the same effect, and that CIA report did get media coverage, to the effect that nuclear weapon use had actively been discussed amongst senior Russian military. But the consensus, surprisingly but not surprisingly, was that it wouldn't be militarily useful in the Ukraine war and would not bring about a Ukrainian capitulation. That it risked the complete and utter destruction both of Russia and of the world, and both in the CIA report and in the SVR blog, quite independently, but a couple of weeks earlier in the SVR blog, it was said that an astonishingly large percentage, as much as 80% of Russia's warheads were actually operationally unusable, inoperable, darts. Of course, we can't rely on the deep darts. Finally, it was said that a number of both missile tests and explosive warhead tests were said to have been tried at Putin's orders and failed. And the SVR blog generally gives you a list of Putin's obscenities when he heard that. In other words, it was more than 50% probable that a tactical warhead fired at Ukrainian troops would simply not detonate at all. Again, of course, you can't rely on that. More recently, having thus inched back a little bit from initiating the apocalypse because of doubts as to whether or not it would actually even work at all, let alone achieve its geopolitical aims, discussion of nuclear weapons use has resurfaced in the Russian scholarly literature, with a certain Professor Kaganov arguing strenuously that Russia should nuke its enemies, by which Kaganov means not Ukraine, but NATO. Kaganov seems to be arguing for what in NATO circles and in US strategic deterrence circles is called a splendid first strike, by which is meant a disarming first strike, a first strike aimed initially at nuclear command and control installations, nuclear silos, and at creating an electromagnetic pulse that would paralyse one's opponents and make one's opponents unable even to give orders for retaliation. The problem is the likelihood of complete success in paralysing command and control is not more than 50-50. And I should add that back in the 1980s, it would have been much lower than that, and that the figure, the probability of success is so high because the US military has, for the last 30 years, rooted its command and control through AT&T, which is not even protected. Kaganov's recommendation has been dismissed as folly, even by his fellow Russian nuclear strategists, who point out that whatever destruction Russia would inflict on NATO would in turn be inflicted on them, and that just as most US citizens and most EU citizens and most Russians will thrive, those who do not will freeze and starve in the ensuing couple of decades of nuclear winter. What is troubling, however, is that Kaganov, and Kaganov has a definite following, in his riposte to the riposte, seems not bothered by this prospect. Indeed, he seems to welcome it. While he does accuse his critics of exaggeration, of exaggerating their case, his case seems more and more theological. And in this, he parallels remarks made back in 2014 by Putin, without Russia there is no need for a world, by his acolyte Margarita Simonian on Russian state TV, and of course back in 1983 on the US side by Senator Strom Thurmond, who happened at the time to be chair of the Senate Select Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence, that the righteous will be raptured to heaven, a prospect that seems more diabolical than divine. One may hope that common sense of some sort will prevail and that buttons will not be pushed. However, the questions arise when, again, Putin's medical prognoses are grim, and they are getting grimmer, and the SVR blog reports that according to his doctors, cancer has now invaded his brain. This may, of course, affect his judgment. If he thinks he's about to die, he may possibly want to take the rest of the world with him, or possibly not. This doesn't mean he will, and it doesn't mean that his minions will obey such an order, but he could, and they might obey it. and again, if Putin experiences continued or more dramatic military reversals, such as the loss of Crimea. I wildly guesstimate, and I challenge anyone who thinks they know, the likelihood of an accidental or not so accidental apocalypse arising from the Ukraine conflict at somewhere between 50-50 and 10%, hopefully closer to 10 these days. There are simply too many unknowns to be more precise. And of course that includes the famous unknown unknowns. That means the likelihood of there not being an accidental or other apocalypse is again somewhere between 50 and 90%. This is actually a whole lot better than exactly 50-50, but only because what we don't and can't know. If our luck runs out totally, and if Putin's subordinates obey his orders and don't shoot him instead, then high-tech civilization will vanish in the first nanosecond as electromagnetic pulse fries electronics. If nothing whatsoever else took place, most people, particularly in the United States, Europe, here, Japan, would anyway perish as every screen went blank, the electricity grid crashed and could not be brought back up. It's worthwhile to point out that the same could be achieved entirely without nukes by a large enough solar mass ejection, and probably will be at some point. Several 100 million to 1 to 2 billion will die in the next phase as cities are transformed into firestorms. As the dark black soot from firestorms circles the Earth, temperatures plunge from global warming levels to below those of the last ice age, and in most places agriculture becomes impossible, at least for a number of decades. 90% of all humans simply starve, and high-tech civilization is over. Those who are left may be lucky in a couple of centuries to recreate medieval levels of civilization. We may well want to believe with Senator Strong-Thurmond that the righteous will indeed be raptured to heaven. In the meantime, the question for those who deem themselves progressive must be, with the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight closer than it's ever been, with the likelihood of nuclear war greater than it has ever been for longer than it has ever been, why isn't the prevention of nuclear war the priority for all those who consider themselves either progressive or merely of vaguely goodwill? In 1983, hundreds of thousands of us marched in this city. The risk now is much, much greater than it was then.
2003.
Where is everyone?
No interjections. No interjections.
2003?
No interjections.
1980.
No, that was
It was
83.
1984, the Tom Uren march, sorry.
83 was when the world nearly ended twice, and various other earth-shaking events, including the tour bus. 83 was the big year. Yes, there were a lot of marches after 83, and some of them, I think the biggest one was actually in 86.
84.
Okay, so I hope that you'll all ask me a few questions.
Are you the only
and-
speaker?
No, there are two speakers. If
No,
you're listening,
Joffrey's going to
please be
speak,
quiet.
Will
and
you
I'm
be
about to hand the mic in. Unless you want to...
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John. And after talking about the Ukraine and East Europe, we shift closer to home, to Taiwan. And I want to begin the talk with a number of premises that I believe that the opposite of war is not peace, but a positive sum economic transaction that can be sustained. So if everyone benefits, why spoil a good thing? Unfortunately, among human beings there exists a simian brain. A simian brain that is evident in how they catch monkeys in Africa, where they dig a hole which they fill with berries and nuts. A hole big enough for a monkey's hand to enter, but too small for his fist to come out. And when he grabs the nuts and fruits, he refuses to let go until it's too late and the hunters catch him. And there is some aspect in our human consciousness that does just that. They take something they don't want to let go, even if their lives are at stake. So, Taiwan. The other thing is, I'd like to give a brief historical context of Taiwan, because China has been making claims that Taiwan belongs to them by virtue of history. That's why I gave around your handouts. If you don't have any, I gave away based on chronological order of those who arrived. So if those with the handouts can kindly share it with their seatmates who don't have the handouts. But Taiwan, in proper historical context, is the land of the Gaussian people and the cradle of Austronesian, Micronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian seafarers who migrated from 3000 BC to 1300 of the Christian Europe. And you'll see the map on your handouts. So by itself, the Taiwanese Aboriginal people are the original custodians of the waters, in the same way the Australian Aborigines are the oldest custodians of the land. And why is this important? Later on, okay. Over time, the Chinese expanded, first through fishing expeditions, and then literal fishing expeditions in the 1200s, the Christian era. And there was an official documentation of a Chinese government expedition in 1358. Over time, it also became the hideaway of state-sponsored pirates of China, Japan, Korea, and Siam, up to the late 1500s. And Europe joined the fray. The Spanish, the Portuguese, who named it Formosa, the Netherlands, France, and the UK in the succeeding 3.5 centuries. So, it is also an area in which there was a collaboration between government and organized crime, and it is mutually beneficial. And Taiwan was not just the only hideaway, it was all over the areas in which the peoples of Taiwan, the original peoples of Taiwan, migrated. Now, some people may not believe this theory, but I remember going to the mountains of Sabah, of Mount Kinabalu, and meeting mountain tribes that had very similar words and languages and syntax as the mountain tribes of the Cordilleras in the Philippines. So there really is a close historical, cultural adhesion, commonality of these people. final victor was Japan, who occupied Taiwan in 1895, modernized it to assimilate its peoples, but was met with resistance by its aborigines. It was eventually returned to China in 1946 when the Kuomintang government expressed a policy quite opposite to its founder Sun Yat-sen to reclaim other territories by drawing a 9-dash line, which the Chinese Communist Party increased to 11 to include Taiwan itself, and a number of islands more annexed by Japan. So, and I say it was against Sun Yat-sen's principles because he was advocating a non-imperialist China, a pro-democrat. He had three principles, which was democracy, popular democracy, economic liberty, including the freedom from poverty, and universal access to economic opportunities from nature, and nationalism. And I tend to strive to define what the Chinese identity was. When in 1948, the Kuomintang, after being defeated and driven away by Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party, set up a belligerent government in that island. And under the KMT, they finally pursued economic reforms more consistent with the principles of its founder, Sun Yat-sen, who's like, imagine he is the George Washington of Taiwan, right? Because he was at the forefront of ending 2,500 years of continuing dynastic successions. And it pursued land reform, cooperative development, industrialization starting from the bottom, favoring small and medium scale industries, and aggressive international trade, pretty much like what Japan did. And it became way more prosperous than China. But at the turn of the century, that's when China and Taiwan began commercial and investment ventures together, as well as infrastructure development, which has grown to the billions of dollars, and even to industries that was vital to China, particularly the semiconductor industries. And over time, there has been saber rattling between China and the USA on behalf of Taiwan, as if it represented democracy, when Taiwan itself was developing its own character of democracy. And economics, if I were to believe in Marx, in this aspect at least, economics precedes culture. When there's an economically mutual benefit in a relationship, then cultural changes and institutions occur. And in this case, they have still a common idea in Sun Yat-sen. If there's anything that can unify both China and Taiwan, or the Kuomintang, better, it's not arms, but that common idea of the three principles that I mentioned. Economic freedoms, popular democracy, and defining a Chinese identity. And I think it would be best if the world helps the two Chinas work towards that direction. So what is a security issue at hand? One is what we call the popularly touted Thucydides trap, where dominant military and even economic power fears its decline because of a rising or ascending political, economic, and military power, which we see in China. If there's any insecurity, it's really between the US and the West declining, and China, Russia, and India ascending. And if you look at the maps right in front, right, you can see the security issues. If you count the number of stars, which is where the military centers or installations of China have been built, it used to be only 2. Now it has grown to this number. Vis-a-vis the US, which is under the auspices of AUKUS, right? It really has triggered a military race in this part of the world. And meanwhile, China has been aggressively engaging in international development finance under a different ideological direction from the World Bank, IMF, and related institutions who, if a country cannot pay its debt, must abide by policy changes where the creditors can actually diminish the sovereignty of a country. Whereas China, on the other hand, would say, so you can't pay your debt for the port? Fine. We'll run it for you for 99 years in the same way Hong Kong was under the British. And we'll train you how to run the facility. So that after 99 years, or maybe even earlier, we turn it over to you and the debt is considered paid. Whereas the World Bank and the IMF would say, you got to privatize your state enterprises, you got to liberalize, you got to open yourselves to foreign investments, you've got to follow the rules of the WTO GATT, etc., which diminish, and I have seen this firsthand, the sovereignty of a country. For China, business is business. And what is its aspiration globally? You have this map at the back. We're talking about a one belt, one road strategy. I've drawn it for you. It wants to draw a belt around the world. It wants to build an alternative parallel canal crossing Nicaragua, which was the original idea, by the way, to match, to be even better than the Panama Canal. It wants to build a canal somewhere in Thailand to cut short voyages from China to India by 6 to 12 hours and establish a financial center. And this scares the Western capitalist framework. Said, gosh, we're in trouble. And China has also broken a rule of the West that says you can only, if you deal with us, the currencies we honor will be the US dollar, the euro, and the yen. Whereas China, including Russia and India, say, hey, we'll accept your currency if you accept ours. Which tends to restore the natural comparative advantages of nations when it comes to trade. So it becomes very beneficial to deal with the BRICS. And more countries want to join, including the Middle East. Resource-rich countries. Labor-rich countries, including India and China. And Southeast Asia. You can imagine the synergy that the developing world, if it joins the bandwagon of the BRICS, will form, and how the West, with its oppressive, capitalistic, financial strategies, and it's been growing and has been diminishing in influence throughout the globe. That is the security threat as I would define it. The second security threat is the very thing that China raises. How about the freedom of naval movement and access to natural resources? This is where I believe, and probably that's also one of the reasons I began wearing this, is that we must help the federation that I show you on this map to federate, globalize, and consolidate, and say freedom of navigation begins with these people. The biggest losers of the current framework of both China and the West are the continuing culture of the Bajau and other seafaring aboriginals of these waters. I think the world, in the same way it must exercise compassion with Julian Assange and with Aborigines and all indigenous peoples, is we defend their rights. These are horribly exploited people by pirates, by governments, by business, by terrorists. I've seen heartbreaking situations where these Bajau, say in Malaysia or even in the Philippines, are kicked out from where they are. They catch children, and based on their language, some estimate, that's where they throw them without their parents, without any support. So they have to eke out a living. They are also recruited by terrorists who provide them at least some security that governments don't. So the priority in terms of security should be for those with the least security of all. And so when the Chinese say freedom of naval movement, yes, let's go all the way. If they're claiming historical precedent, yes, let's go all the way. And if it comes to some unification of China, sure. I think we can live with Taiwan and China reunifying. But it has to be on the terms of the Taiwanese itself. In the same way Australia is coming to terms with reconciling with the Aboriginal people, the original and most ancient stewards of the land. And in this case, the most ancient Aboriginal stewards of the waters. So, I do want to end the talk with hope that rather than be moved by fear or even hate for the enemy, we start reorienting our views towards what peace really is and towards defending the rights of the most harmed sector of society by this conflict. And is it possible? I'll end it also with another interesting anecdote about in 2022, early 2022, towards the end of the term of Duterte, 200 Chinese fishing vessels, wink wink, again encroaches the Philippines and makes formations as if it's a base. And China was telling the Philippines, oh, don't worry, they're just fishing vessels. Formed as bases. And then, after about a few weeks, they magically back up and leave. And donate to the Philippines 2 million free COVID vaccines. Free. They leave, and upon leaving, that's where the Americans come in full force, with bravado, the 7th Fleet, saying, oh, we're here. Maybe that's why we scared them off. I said, yeah, you're like the cops that came in after the primacy movement.
After the what?
After the crime has been committed, right? That's how the US look. But it would show, and I don't think I'll get liberty to tell why they backed up and left. It would show that the Chinese are not invulnerable. You just have to tickle them in the right places so that they back up and leave.
Perhaps not totally.
They're not totally inflexible, as you can see, as you have witnessed. But my warning is, do not poke the dragon, especially when you poke the bear. Because if you think China is helpless, I'd like you to remember the scene where the Chinese battleships entered Sydney Harbor without any warning. And the government simply said, no, we expected it. Yes. The Chinese have military strategic packages that many of us are not aware of. So my advice is, don't poke the dragon. And third is, I went to a forum on national security. And so one of the questions they said before they would admit me was, what's the biggest security threat to Australia? I said, it's corrupt politicians opening the back door to corrupt foreign governments. And I was not welcome to attend. Which means the worst enemy that we must now face is the enemy inside. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. I think Jeff wants to ask a question.
Yes.
I've got a question for both speakers, but first I must protest at politics in the pub descending into nothing but a cover for the CIA, the FBI and the deep state of America, and becoming total apologists for the Biden nuclear regime and the ASEAN-backed Filipino regime. My question to John Hallam is, your nuclear clock might have moved on 90 seconds from when you used to come to politics in the pub and say that Pakistan and India are going to blow the shit out of the world in the next 5 weeks, years, minutes or whatever. Now it's the dreadful Russians with Putin having brain disease. We won't talk about Biden's mental state. That would be fighting both superpowers. And this demonstrates how far the left has degenerated when we have nothing but an apologist for NATO representing the Ukraine-Russia debate. And as for our Filipino spokesperson from the ASEAN bloc, he mentions don't upset the Chinese bear. What about the 4 US military bases that were opened up in the Philippines in the last 3 months, which he doesn't even mention in his speech? Talk about covering up for US imperialism. You're both nothing but Yankee stooges as far as I'm concerned. Now, getting back to my question.
Yeah, let's have a question.
My question relates to, when did the Russian-Ukrainian war start? When the agreement between the US and the USSR led to the withdrawal of 400,000 Soviet bloc troops from East Germany with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1991, where the West assured the USSR as it was then, that they would not encroach on the Warsaw Pact countries. We're now looking at 2002, 19 countries had been signed up to NATO that were previously not aligned or part of the Warsaw Pact. And as for the actual invasion in 2022, that would be covered under the UN collective security arrangement, similar to Kosovo, where one can allow an ethnic Russian community to rejoin Russia when it's facing linguistic, cultural and extinction through genocide from the pro-Ukrainian banning the Russian language from the Donbass and similar areas. As for Taiwan, the only reason why the Under-Secretary of State was there trying to suck up to the Chinese leadership 2 weeks ago was that the Americans, if you watch the latest YouTubes, have no longer feared the 90% control that Taiwan has over microchips, because they've replicated in the Arizona desert a complete restructuring of the exact plants from Taiwan, which are now under construction in the USA. And the rapprochement between China and the USA may have gone ahead had not Biden opened his mouth as soon as the talks were over and said that, oh, the Chinese are a dictatorship. So his foot and mouth has prevented the rapprochement. And you, as an Asian Australian, should have more sensitivity to the fact that my ancestors were part of the Yellow Peril, the Chinese citizens in Australia from long ago, over a century ago, who were Ching Chong Chinamen when I was growing up, and my father got persecuted as a half Chinese in this country. And you might have yellow skin, but you're just reinfecting the Pauline Hanson yellow skin virus that is behind the anti-Chinese sentiments in Australia at the moment.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much.
And what was the question?
The question is, when did the Ukraine war start?
Okay,
it
thank you.
started with the NATO expansion.
Well, you're answering yourself.
What, 2014? Well, he'll deny that.
You can answer first.
Okay.
Before or after the coup?
Don't answer. No, you can answer first.
Before the coup. Of course, yeah.
These things are very much a matter of definition. I don't consider that it started that early. I do think that NATO could have been faulted for having expanded when it said that it wouldn't. However, I am mindful that the governments of Eastern Europe, that, I spent 20 years disagreeing with the Polish government's desire to be part of NATO. I spent 20 years basically apologising for Russia. Mea culpa. Never again. Never again.
Putin is a uranium shells
Sorry.
the Ukraine war. The British need to go.
I'm sorry.
The uranium shells
Putin
the British.
is a bloody fascist, and the greatest risk to the world from nuclear war, I'm sorry, comes from him.
Depleted uranium shells. Russia's banned them, but the Ukrainians are using them to kill their own people. And they're bombing the biggest nuclear power plant in all of Europe.
If you'd like to have your own meeting, can we just get on with this one?
I'll exercise more.
Oh, yellow peril.
I'll exercise more mutual respect than you, and hope you know
I know.
that. Okay.
But you're a China basher. You're part of ASEAN's bloc.
Okay.
You're
While I'm being accused,
While I'm being accused,
To Joffrey for being pro-China.
while I'm being
not pro-China, he's an apologist.
while I'm being accused, and I don't like to make accusations. Remember that you must assume innocence until proven otherwise. And I don't know if you have the ability to respect that principle.
What? I didn't hear Stephen.
Yeah, you don't because you're too obsessed.
No, Stephen's ass was.
I tell you this.
What?
Assume innocence until proven otherwise.
What are you talking about?
A principle, yeah, you don't understand that principle of innocence until proven otherwise, and you have accused me. Now shut up! Shut up! Shut up and let me. You do not just shoot. You knew were the Nazi.
Apologize!
No, I don't expect an apology from him because I only expect it from people who have noble character.
Well, I'm Chinese. You're not. You're an Asian stooge.
First of all,
Who
First of all, I'd like to thank Jefferson for going to specifics. And
Politics in the pub here, come and join us.
and I hope that Jefferson will learn basic principles of decency, of respect, of innocence until proven otherwise during
I
an
don't support
accusation.
the CIA apologists.
And I don't support them either.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, you don't, because you speak out of absolute ignorance.
You got 4 new
And let me explain.
Tell us about the US bases.
I am going to, you asshole!
Yeah, tell us about
I will, because I was one of them who wanted it kicked out, and it did get kicked out. You asshole! You don't do that, now you know!
what?
But I was there, getting it kicked out, and you accuse me, you asshole!
The dirty
Oh, well, that's another charge. No. I just want to answer.
Stop!
I just want to answer his charges.
Stop! Don't denigrate him for that. Don't degenerate. Just talk normally.
Thank you. I agree. I'm sorry for stooping down to this level.
Yeah, don't.
I'm sorry.
There's no need to scream, right?
Jefferson does this everywhere.
Oh, thank you.
And
We will get banned if we carry
but
on like
here's-
this, so thank you, Jeff.
but
When you get your ass out of
but
my
here
face,
and may I continue? He claims to be more Chinese than I. My great-grandfather and grandfather were Sun Yat-sen supporters. They went to the Philippines because the Philippines is a good example at the time when they were kicking Americans out. When the Katipunan was beating the Americans in every battle. So, I do have a good history of the Philippines. Proud of it. We may have been oppressed, but we fought back. And we just don't complain. We try to solve the problem.
you defended Turtic. He's a mass murderer.
And that's another issue. I'm not for, when it comes to Duterte. The lawyer that filed cases in the Hague is a friend of mine. And I said, go ahead, by all means. So I do not defend Duterte. I say, let the wheels of justice grind. Now, with regard to the bases, I definitely am against the return of military installations in the Philippines, which Marcos, the current Marcos Jr., allowed to come in. And I am also pretty much disturbed that before the elections, Biden was whipping the charges to be filed against Marcos Jr. And when Marcos won the elections, that's another story. What happened to those charges? Instead, he became a sweetheart, a darling of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And that's why there are more military installations now that grew in 1 year than in 30, 40, 50 years. So it's pretty disturbing. And I'm not the only one protesting it. A lot of Filipinos in the Philippines don't like what's happening. And so, just to set the record right, I don't apologize for Marcos. I let the wheels of justice grind for Duterte. And I assure innocence until proven otherwise. Because that's principles of decency I have been brought up with. And so, I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask one question myself. If you listen to Chomsky...
You should, as chair, take the rest of the room first, dear Hog. You interjected all the speeches. Take the rest of the room first. Well, as chair, it should take the rest of the room first.
Would you like to take the meeting, Jeff? You've got the landowner's voice.
Let
Give
the rest of the room ask their questions first. You're chairing it. That's
I
a
thought you were
normal
chairing. I thought you
procedure.
were holding a meeting.
No, that's meeting.
I'd like to ask.
Everything.
I move that Jefferson no longer be heard.
I second that.
I second that too. Third that. Who am I?
You had a question? Steve, you had a
Is there
question?
anyone else?
He had a question.
Anyone else have a question?
Yeah, g'day, gents. That was a nice presentation. My question verges on the globalist one world government, New World Order agenda. Russia seems to be putting a big thorn in the side of the globalists. They protected Syria from the Yanks. That was a domino that had to fall.
Can we make the question?
Russia paid off its debt.
Mr. Concannon,
Two-
make it a question, please.
2 minutes, sir. Russia doesn't owe any money to the globalists anymore. China is doing away with the US dollar. It's taken US hegemony away. So my question is, do you think Russia and China are the two biggest roadblocks to the one world government, New World Order? And BRICS, of course.
Good question.
I don't even think in those terms, in fact they're meaningless to me. China has its own version of globalism, which of course would like to be globalism led by China. Globalism, if it were to happen at all, would involve cooperation, not competition, between the Chinese globalists and the American globalists. Russia definitely isn't part of the globalist equation, and I think that for the short term at least, well, for the next century anyway, Russia as a power is probably finished.
Sorry, what's Russia?
Unless, of course, they should happen to blow up the world, which they are in a position to do, and which they repeatedly threaten to do.
That's a good question, and I think we should go beyond.
But the terms of the question are terms that I would probably reject.
Are you done? That is a good question. And I think at this moment, we shouldn't be limited to picking a side. Because you're saying, are they the bloc, therefore should we be on their side? No. I think we should exercise a very strong sense of political and economic discernment. Let's go back to very basic principles of, that's why I began with the preamble, what's the opposite of war? It isn't peace, because I can point a gun for someone to shut up, and that's not peace. The opposite of war is really a positive sum, synergistic relationship and transactions among a mutual respect. And I think the biggest obstacle is really awakening that in all of us. We have to have the humility of saying, I might be wrong. I might be accusing someone with not enough evidence and out of ignorance. And I just might be asserting my position by screaming, which I did a while ago. I apologize. Thank you.
I am Harriet Electrical. I live here for 43 years.
Speak up.
Closer to your
Can't hear.
closer to your mouth.
I've got an arsehole blocking my view.
Okay. I live in Australia 43 years. I know a lot of, left-wing or idea whatsoever here, I'm the author. I write book in the internet blog, It's Google blog. One is a one word in 2009. Second one is a one word cyber kit and the age of history. It's still on the internet.
I can't hear, sorry.
It is still on the internet blog. If you want to have a look, you go have a look. my purpose so is about world government. So cooperation, not fighting, and anything that the country try to solve it, something like that, because we are all human. Humanity has got to be, like Karl Marx said, one word. Karl Marx said one word. So, the working people united and put a word, one word. That idea is still very useful, and it got to be like that. If we have to go to the nuclear war, this and that, that's it that I want to talk. All right.
What's the question?
The question is, we Australia got to try to understand the world more than today, because Australia is isolated by geography and by history too, and very much controlled by the English. So, for example, so many ideas, so many policies that Liberal Party put into Australia, it comes from the top of the Liberal Party that pro England. So sir, I went to London about 2 months ago. I did talk to Labour people over there. They say Tony Abbott is the one that generate and form the idea of a submarine, and of course that sort of thing. So we don't know that. All the things that we neglect, not try to understand, is about how the English control us by using people that individual on the top of the door that were very English. So we are not independent yet.
In a nutshell.
What's your question? Okay.
In a nutshell.
Yes, what was the
One sentence.
Okay. My question is, do we have to examine ourselves about looking to the world? Do we have to do that?
Do we have to?
I'm still bugging if I know what the question was. However, I would comment that everything that you thought that you knew until February 24th is now upside down, and the left needs to get its head around that. And if you can't, then you're just going to end up repeating the same old cliches over and over again, even when the people you end up supporting are outright fascists.
All right. May I have a question?
Okay. I would like to ask one question at the end, after, perhaps after you. Should I say something? No, let's speak into it.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm bringing to some information which you don't know. Should I say something before I ask a question? Or?
Briefly, if.
Briefly, okay.
Thank you.
Yesterday I had a conversation with my nephew. He's 40 years old. He lives in Southern Russia. He doesn't watch TV. He has 6 children.
Closer, please.
He is quite religious, and his inside view about what's going on. He said, I don't know who are they just make sure that we'll build much less of us. This is his interpretation. He said, they just want to have less of us here. All right, I'm sorry. It's his comment yesterday, right? Last night.
He's absolutely correct.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Let him finish.
Please show some respect if you don't like it.
I'm agreeing with you.
I did ask you, do you agree or not?
Okay.
I'm still talking. So now my question is, you draw here yellow lines. You see they go through Russia. Do you know they can't go through now? Do you see any connection between the conflict?
You just pointed it out. I agree with
And before I finish, remember February 1979 when China attacked Vietnam?
you. Right.
All right?
I remember when Vietnam invaded Cambodia. He asked me a question, I'm giving him an answer.
What was the question?
The connection between these yellow lines going through Russia and the conflict in
It's
Ukraine.
a good observation.
Because these yellow lines can't go through Russia.
Yeah. First of all, maybe we're going back to COVID. They want less of us. The continent that has had the lowest COVID infection, the least severity, the lowest mortality, and the lowest excess deaths is Africa. Because they were the least vaccinated. Wait. No. That's statistics, okay? I'm not.
Sir, I didn't ask about this.
This is statistics. Oh, well, I'm just saying statistics.
They
Right?
avoided the poison.
What's it got to do? They want less of us.
No, I didn't ask about this. I said
No.
these yellow lines.
But I am agree with that. And second is you pointed out something right in the map that with that war, that line is broken. They don't want that line to happen. Do you know that the pipelines of Russia, the direct pipelines to Germany, the Nord Stream 1 is 70 billion metric, I forgot the measures, compared to all the pipelines going through the Ukraine is 80, right? If they had opened Nord Stream, that would have been 140 plus 30, the other pipeline. 140 plus 1, it would be more than double what goes through Ukraine.
You don't answer my question.
No, I am answering your question in a sense that...
The pipeline through Ukraine still operational.
You mean they didn't
Yeah,
blow
and
them
no
up?
one stopped it.
You mean they didn't blow up Nord Stream? I guess that's...
No,
what
I
you
didn't
said.
say. I said the pipeline through Ukraine is operational,
yes,
and the
yes.
Ukrainians get paid for this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
And
know.
Russians get paid.
Yeah, but the Nord Stream...
So don't deviate from my
But
question.
the Nord Stream has been cut, and Nord Stream is part of that.
Nord Stream, all right?
Nord Stream.
Yeah. And by the way, it's Mr. Karaganov, not Karganov.
Anyway, if he doesn't want to accept my answer, I can do that.
I'd like to ask one question. Okay.
John
John, we want to
Wilkins,
say something, and then I'd like to ask a question.
John Wilkins
and then it will
wants
be
to ask a
sitting at the back. Thank you. You can make your own meeting to chair.
You said they want less of us.
Yes.
I would say that Russian government policy, and particularly military policy, is consistent with that.
Yeah.
However, if things go to their logical conclusion, then it won't be less of us, it'll be none of us.
Yeah, sure. It's the next step.
I'd like to ask before these two gentlemen over here.
India and Pakistan were going to blow us up 20 years ago, by the way.
I'd like to ask one
They're
question.
still here.
That is, presumably we don't want a nuclear war. Everyone in this room would, I think, concur that we don't want a nuclear war. Seeing as Australia is intimately involved with the United States, not intimately involved with Russia, and not intimately involved with China, it's a trading partner. Intimately involved with the United States and its military plans. So this is our responsibility comes in here. I think Chomsky, if he was here, perhaps would like to ask, what is our role, do you think? Being an ally of the United States, not speculating about the health or otherwise of Putin or anyone else or the pathology of whatever it is, but the United States, which definitely has had a role in both these conflicts or potential conflicts. What should we do as people in Australia who are citizens of the country intimately allied with the United States?
Boycott them.
Cancel AUKUS, obviously, and we should also get rid of Northwest Cape and Pine Gap.
Yeah,
because
Pine,
those
sure.
are perhaps even more important than AUKUS. Pine Gap in particular is the single largest CIA installation outside CIA headquarters, and because it is from there that the United States would direct much of its nuclear war effort. That makes it almost the number one or number two target on the entire world. So if we don't want to be toast, those are some obvious things that we should do. However, I don't agree that the state of Mr. Putin or anyone else's health is of no interest. Certainly if it is either the President of Russia or the President of the United States, then their ability to think straight and what they might do when the big black briefcase gets opened is of interest to every sentient being on the entire planet.
Well, I have said that the biggest security threat of Australia is its corrupt politicians that open the back door. And I think this is really a time for Australia to peer deep into its soul and say, what do we really stand for?
Yes.
If the US is not an ally. It's a very serious question. And that's the only answer I can give. But I agree with John, but the deeper question is, what do we stand for?
Armed neutrality.
We know what we're against, but what do we stand for?
Armed neutrality.
One world government?
No way.
Thank you.
It's an Australian.
I did promise. We'll get to all of that.
Hi, my name's John Wilkinson. Many years ago I actually did a PhD which involved looking at military strategy. I want to present a scenario to you and then ask your opinion about whether the implications of that scenario, as I might explain, makes any sense. Dean Acheson, who was not only Secretary of State in 1949, but he signed the NATO agreement. He was one of the original founders of NATO, Secretary of State in 1949, said in his memoirs, when he spoke about Berlin and Tokyo, he said, Berlin and Tokyo, where law and justice flowed from the will of the occupying conqueror. And that, I think, signifies that the ultimate decider between nations is war. And that's how you decide things, because that's how things were decided in Germany and Japan. In that context of war and conflict between, well, as you well know, being on the left as I am, the rich and powerful, or the leaders of nations, because everyone else just simply has to go and fight, but they make the decisions in terms of those conflicts between the elites of those nations. Geographical parts of the world become crucial if they can be useful to waging war, one nation to another. And in 1941, when Germany attacked Russia, there were three armies that went to Russia. The north one went through Belarus, the most southern one went down to the Caucasus to get the oil fields of Baku, and the middle one went through Ukraine. Led by
It's not correct.
It is.
It's factually not correct.
Let me just, you can go to the Encyclopedia Britannica on the web and look up the Britannica, and that's what happened. That's in the Western sphere of things why Ukraine is so important to the Americans and the British. Over on the other side of the world, Taiwan in the Second World War was described by Douglas MacArthur as Japan's unsinkable aircraft carrier. MacArthur claimed afterwards that all the attack on the Philippines and Southeast Asia through Indonesia that followed was attributable to Japan's control of Taiwan after 1895. Now it seems to me that if you follow that through, you're left with two scenarios that flow out of that. Either war is going to simply be the arbiter of everything, and that's the path that nations will follow, or is it possible that diplomacy can somehow stop this in its tracks, or at least slow it down? Because if diplomacy can't do that...
So what's the question,
then, well, I'm just asking John and Geoffrey if they think it's true that war then becomes the only possible path that those nations will take.
You shouldn't mix up what happened in
Russia's
2021.
trying diplomacy in the
Shut
West.
up!
Bring it up. Minsk Accord.
Don't respond.
I think that to put things in terms of a polarity between war and diplomacy, I think polarities are always a mistake. So I instinctively not want to go down that road, and I would instinctively want to unask that question. It's the wrong question. Way back in the 3rd century BC, I think it was, when Rome conquered Greece, the Greeks immediately took over, in many ways, the Roman Empire. And there was even a little poem written about it, which I can't remember properly, so I won't recite it. But historically, it hasn't been the case that military might has necessarily decided everything. It is certainly true that after World War II, the supposedly conquered Japan and Germany again provided the economic powerhouse that propelled the world through an unprecedented era of economic expansion. Now, economic expansion may not actually be a good thing, but that is another matter. So again, I would not agree, and I would say that the evidence is against that war decides everything. How many times have the supposed victors ended up on their knees and the supposed conquerors been the ones with the money and the industrial effort? So no, I disagree with every premise you've used.
Minsk Accord.
Yeah, I also tend to side with John that what could determine the fate of civilization is the ability to think of what I could describe as the positive sum outcomes. That's good for everyone. The alternative to taking sides is actually initiating, federating these peoples. Because if you can look at the map, Australia is right at the center. It could convene. It could be a convener. Rather than wait for the cue of the US as to what to do. I'd say this is an interesting map that Australia can consider and say, all right, people of the Austronesian, Micronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian backgrounds, let's have a convention in Australia, maybe in Darwin. Try to iron things out in the context of the threats to security in the world. So that's my answer there.
Thank you.
I'd like to, Joe, my name's Joe Lee Parker. Yeah, I'd like to thank both speakers. I found it very interesting and informative. I just happened to notice that Joffrey's speech had a lot more on history, explaining some fascinating things about the history of Taiwan, whereas John's speech was rather more on the history of Ukraine. And I'd just like to say, well, I haven't answered to a question somebody asked, is when did the Ukraine conflict start? I think it started with Tsarina Catherine. Before then, Poland was completely different to Russia. There was no one sphere of influence, Russia and Poland and Warsaw Pact also. She extended Russia into Europe, and it was not so different. I mean, you can read Shakespeare, he mentions Poland, they're part of Europe. And I think in the long term, that invasion into Poland, can contribute that to. Then you contribute the Napoleonic campaign to the First World War, the Second World War, in part to that instability of Poland. So Poland is now, when it was an independent country with its own king,
Are we talking
it
Poland or Ukraine?
it had as much influence over the Ukraine as Russia, or even more. Then when Poland, of course, was conquered, then Ukraine became part of the thing also, and you have the mess that's today. And the point I'm trying to make is that you can take back history and it changes, and there's a lot of change. The question is really rather similar to this gentleman's. With all of this change and all the different political situations, and with all these questions about who's controlling what, is it the major powers, the global powers, is it personalities, is it the sickness of some major leader, and people screaming at one another, and seeing all of this is taking place. My question is a mathematical one. We have nuclear weapons now. John has told us the details of the nuclear story. It was very close to war back in the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1980s. Mathematically, even if there's only a 10% chance on education that the nuclear weapons will be let off, when it keeps on going, eventually it becomes almost mathematical certainty.
The Americans pulled out of START and the intermediate range thing. Well, you interject, I can interject too. The Yanks pulled out of START. Well, stop touching me, that's the self. That's the self. That's the self. It is.
My question is that there even might be some wildly unconsidered interjections.
The Yanks pulled out
and
of START.
eventually we are all doomed. I'm a pessimist and saying, you too, are you pessimists also?
So what's the question?
Are you pessimists?
Are we all eventually doomed?
Oh, come on, no.
That's it.
It's got to be a
mention something.
little bit of hope.
I'm sorry that the one.
Got to be a little bit of hope.
Can I say the one female person who's left is leaving because this is absolutely uncivilized. The interjections.
Yeah, because
So,
you're an apologist for Ukraine. Green Left Weekly supporter. You're not an unbiased chair.
You know, if you honestly believe you're right, then it will happen. But if you honestly believe you're wrong, I hope it does happen.
I don't have any power. I don't know what's going to happen.
And we all do. That's our problem. Our problem is, I think powerful people want us to actually believe we are helpless. That everything depends on them. So it's about time we turn the tables. That's why we speak. That's why we engage. I won't give up. And I hope no one else here does.
John might answer your question. The Yanks pulled out START and the IMF in the last 12 months. And he didn't mention that. All he spoke
I'm not
about
quite sure what to do in this situation. I've
talked
lived here for a number of years. I'm saying you for a number of years. I just like to say I'm not sure. How shall I, sorry, I'll throw it open. How shall I cope with this situation?
Ask
I'm
John
meant to be
why
charity.
the Americans
That's it,
pulled
John.
out.
Go ahead, John.
You're the nuclear expert, John. Why did the Yanks pull out of IMF and START?
It's complicated.
Oh yeah, tell us about it.
And undoubtedly, the US bears a great deal of the blame for that. However, I'm not sure about START. As I said, it's complicated. These things usually are. Your point about the math is essentially correct, and the odds are a lot worse than 1 or 2% at the moment, I would say. We are at a juncture where the probability of a nuclear exchange, global nuclear exchange, is greater than it has ever been in history, and unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted a couple of weeks, it's lasting for years and years. So I confess that I verge between pessimism and outright terror. Now, it is true that in the past we could usually look for insane pronouncements from the likes of Senator Strong Thurmond. We're now getting them from the acolytes of Mr. Putin.
And Lindsey Graham. Senator Lindsey Graham.
And they're very similar sounding statements. That the righteous will somehow be raptured to heaven and that we will all go together when we go, and that will be wonderful. And this gives me little comfort. However, it is important to try to do something to take control of our fate. And it is important that the nuclear weapons issue be put at the top of the progressive agenda. And it isn't, and as I said, where the bloody hell are we when it comes to that issue?
Bring back start with the IMF treaty.
5 seconds to midnight. Let's reverse that.
Mark Marisic, first of all, just a quick preamble about Poland, which has been mentioned a few times. While ideally, of course, eastward expansion of NATO isn't necessarily the best thing, I can well understand why Poland, given its long history of oppression by Russia, would want to seek some sort of protection, even though it might be from a body that most of us here might not agree with. So I would say that there's been just as much pull factor from the countries of Eastern Europe themselves as there has been push from the West. So I think that's something that everyone on the left should acknowledge, that countries of Eastern Europe were horribly repressed during the Soviet era, and if they want to join some sort of protection, whatever it is, then it's certainly their choice. But my question actually ties in with a couple of previous ones about the hopes for diplomacy and peace and so on. Recently in the news there was the African delegation. I haven't heard anything more about that recently. If you would have any updates about what came of that, and what sort of, if anything, might sort of come out of that sort of going forward. And also about President Lula in Brazil. There's perhaps some promising moves there.
I can answer that
Same views of 24 hours of African delegation.
The African delegation presented what might well have been a common sense way forward. The African delegation visited both Kiev and Moscow, and essentially got nowhere. And I think that is an absolute tragedy.
And what about Lula of Brazil?
I don't know enough about what happened with Lula.
He's a globalist.
But the Africans really deserved a lot more success than they got.
The one with the microphone.
Yeah. Actually, even if they have failed, they shouldn't give up. And maybe Africa should work with these nations. Maybe we should take a bigger approach.
What about the UN?
And no.
Everybody's forgotten that.
And maybe the UN has been forgotten because it has not been doing its job.